Rainbow Family Life Stories by Jodey Bateman. Interviews with Rainbow Family of Living Light folks conducted between 1977 and 2008. Scanned in 2018. Jodey Bateman may be contacted on Facebook. 16.B.Jodey.LifeStory2, My Life, 2 of 2. My Life, Part 4, Jodey Bateman. By this time we could operate almost without fear of sudden arrest or worse. We were involved in a struggle for control of the federal government's new Head Start program for children in poverty. Civil rights workers, both black and white, had set up Head Start centers in a number of counties under a group called Child Development Group of Mississippi, CDGM. Quitman County, where Marks was the county seat, was a low-priority area as far as the statewide civil rights movement was concerned. There were no attempts by civil rights workers from outside the county to bring in CDGM. The most active local black people in the movement in Quitman County did not hear of CDGM until it was too late to become part. The most important thing about CDGM, as far as we were concerned, was that it hired women in poverty and trained them to work with the kids. Because Quitman County blacks had found out too late about CDGM to get included in that program, the county was put with 4 other counties under a war on poverty corporation called Mid-State Opportunities. Mid-State was run by a white man named Rex McCraney. He was our local version of a trend all over the South. Whites in positions of authority were coming over to the side of an integrated society. Better-known whites who were making this move at the time were Al Gore and Jimmy Carter. But CDGM had the radical idea of the potential of women in poverty to run Head Start. Mid-State wanted to give the Head Start jobs to the black teachers. The black teachers were very underpaid and wanted the jobs to help them get through vacations. But however badly the black teachers were paid, the women in poverty were much worse off. Alec Shimkin set up volunteer Head Start centers at black churches around Quitman County to show that women in poverty could run these centers well. The women did this work with the children without pay for several months and paid for food for the children out of their own limited money. Black parents went to PTA meetings and made it very clear that they would not send their children to Head Start centers unless the women in poverty were hired. Finally, a compromise was reached. Half the women hired would be teachers, half were from the women in poverty. While this was going on, there was a march against fear from Memphis to Jackson to encourage Mississippi black people to vote in the first election since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The march was started by James Meredith, the black man who integrated the University of Mississippi in 1962. His first day marching, he was shot in the back of the head by a white man. He survived and was taken to a hospital. Dr. Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael continued as leaders of the march. Reverend Coleman, our project director in Marks, and Alec and I joined the march, though from time to time Alec and I left to do other work. Other people from Marks joined the march. One of them, Armstead Phipps, age 58, the father of 8 young children, died of a heart attack while marching in the Mississippi heat. Dr. King came to Marks and preached the funeral sermon for Mr. Phipps at a church that was crowded with people. I went outside and met on the steps of the church Richard Arvidin, age 18, a white youth from Fort Worth, Texas. Richard had asked Stokely Carmichael's permission to stay on in Marks as a civil rights worker, and Stokely agreed. Richard would become important in my life. I stayed in Marks to help get people out to vote in the first free election in Mississippi since 1890, when the literacy test for voters was first enacted. Then I heard how in Canton, Mississippi, the highway patrol fired tear gas into a crowd of marchers who were camped on a school ground. Alec and Richard came back from Canton to Marks, very ill from the tear gas. Alec went to Jackson, where he could get his health back. Richard felt well enough to stay in Marks. I went to Canton and joined the marchers in completing the walk to Jackson. A lot more happened. The most important thing I can say is that it seems strange to me to be trying to get funding for Head Start from the Johnson administration while that same Johnson administration kept escalating the war in Vietnam. I went back to Marks and wound up things there as best I could, after the compromise about the Head Start centers was reached. Then, in October 1966, I went back to Oklahoma to help with the anti-war movement. I continued to receive letters from the Franklin family and Marks, and I sent letters back to them all during the years to come. During 1967, I met up with Richard Arvidon again several times. He was now the leader of the SDS chapter in Fort Worth. On May Day 1968, the first edition of the Jones family's grandchildren came out in Norman. It was named for the Jones family, a secret society to help young men escape the draft in 1917 during World War I. It was set up near Norman, Oklahoma, by a rancher named Bohannon. I found out later I was related to him by marriage. Also in the summer of 1968, there was a gathering of the tribes in the Colorado Rockies. 3 people from Norman went to that gathering. One of them was Carol Neher. I am still in contact with her through Facebook. Years later, Carol told me that she met Barry Plunker Adams and his wife Ellen Light at that gathering. This gathering of the tribes was called by Mountain Don Kelsey. The story, as it was heard in Norman, was that people were going to Colorado to escape from an asteroid called Icarus that was supposed to crash into California. But Jackson Phelan, who spread the word to come to that gathering, has told me that the asteroid was definitely not part of the message that Mountain Don asked him to give. Our underground newspaper, The Jones Family's Grandchildren, continued until April 1971, when we put out our last edition for Earth Day. In the summer of 1971, I moved to Oklahoma City, where I was part of a left-wing community center called People's Workshop. We put out an underground newspaper called The Well. People's Workshop was closed down in December 1971 by pressure from businesses in the area. They didn't like all the hippie-looking people who came for rock concerts and other events at People's Workshop, not to mention the interracial couples who came to People's Workshop. So I moved to Lawton, Oklahoma, and helped with another underground newspaper called Barrage. The main people with Barrage were Scott and Georgia Cade. Scott Cade was active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Most of the people who bought the paper were soldiers at Fort Sill, the large army post just outside Lawton. 3 active duty soldiers stayed at our house and helped with the underground paper. By this time, early 1972, almost all the enlisted soldiers I met were against the Vietnam War. This was not my first time living in Lawton. I sang at a bar in Lawton in 1969. Even earlier in 1968, I sang at a coffee house just outside Fort Hood, Texas. I can say from my own observation that as early as 1968, over half the Army enlisted personnel I met were against the war. In January 1972, a man started coming by our house who owned a dress store in Lawton. He said he had been an Army intelligence officer in Vietnam, but that he was sympathetic to our cause. He brought a woman with him who was supposedly his girlfriend. Then the supposed girlfriend came by herself to visit us. She told us that this man worked for the police. She said he had tried to pressure her to plant drugs in our house. And then the police would raid our place. She said this man had threatened her that if she didn't plant drugs in our house, he would see that she lost custody of her child because she had a prior history of prostitution. Not many nights after that, this man came to our house by himself. As always, we had a pitcher of Kool-Aid and a glass on our living room coffee table. As usual, this man asked for some of the Kool-Aid. I went into another room, so I was not present, but I understand that after he drank the Kool-Aid, Scott Cade told him that there was LSD in it. Then Scott held up an aspirin and told him that the aspirin was a downer, and that he would give him the downer to bring him off the LSD if he would write a statement for us about what he had been doing. The man wrote out that the Lawton police had asked him to spy on us, and that after several visits to our house, he had told the police that nothing harmful was going on at our place. He wrote that the police had asked him to plant drugs in our place, but that he had told them that he would not do so. Then Scott told him that there was no LSD in the Kool-Aid. The man left our house, forced himself to throw up and checked into a hospital. About an hour later, the Lawton police raided our house and looked through everything. They cut open mattresses. I realized now that they were looking for the paper that this dress store owner/police informer had written out for Scott. But Scott had hidden it carefully, and the only person he told of its location was his wife, Georgia. The police broke a record album that belonged to one of the soldiers who stayed at our house, and they tore up my typewriter. They cuffed my hands behind my back and took me to the cop car and forced me to sit on my hands. To say the least, it was uncomfortable. I was charged with conspiracy to commit assault, but these charges were later dropped. I had not even been in the room at the time the incident occurred. The next day, February 8, 1972, was my 30th birthday. My grandmother came from Duncan, 30 miles away, and got me out of jail. Steve Jones, a lawyer from the ACLU, got Scott Cade out of jail. Scott, Georgia, and I moved to Norman. Scott was acquitted at his trial because he had the written words of the man who had been spying on us for the police about our anti-war activities, not for any punishable crime. In June 1972, I went to visit some friends in Norfolk, Virginia. While I was there, I saw in a newspaper about the Rainbow Gathering near Granby, Colorado. All I could conclude about it at the time was that a bunch of cranks were gathering in the Rockies to console themselves because Nixon was going to be re-elected president. I did not connect the gathering at Granby with the gathering of the tribes in 1968, 4 years earlier, which my friend Carol Nair had gone to. When I came back to Oklahoma, I met Freedom, Don Driggers. He was one of the group of friends around Carol Nair. I did not know then that he had gone up to Granby for the gathering, but left because of all the National Guard troops near the parking lot with guns. He turned around and came back to Oklahoma. It was also in 1972, at age 30, that I began to feel a new surge of energy. I was recovering from my years in Mississippi, which had taken a great deal of vitality out of me. Also in 1972, my body began to recover from the effects of premature birth, as our family doctor had predicted would happen by the time I reached 40. I was already into this recovery by the time my mother told me about the doctor's prediction, though I never recovered completely. I can say that in 1973, when I was 31, I could feel for the first time the movement of the muscles in my body. Before that, I could only feel the surface. In 1973, I was back into a familiar pattern. I was staying with my brother Jack in an apartment in Norman and working in a Pizza Hut. Jack moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to share an apartment with my brother Jim. A lot of Norman people had been moving to Santa Fe, starting in 1968. Jim worked in a musical instrument store. Jason, who is interviewed in this book, knew my brother Jim. Jim repaired his guitar. I stayed on in Norman. In 1974, I was listening to the song Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner. In my mind's eye, I saw the blue denim shirt from Kilby Prison in Alabama that belonged to my fellow civil rights worker Alec Shimkin. Before, Alec had gone to jail in Parchman Prison in Mississippi because the jail in Natchez, Mississippi was too full. He had gone to prison in Alabama in March 1965 because the jail where he was in that state was too full. So I decided to see where Alec was now in 1974. I called the home of Dr. Dmitry Shimkin, Alec's father, who was an anthropology professor at the University of Illinois. The phone was answered by Edith Shimkin, Alec's mother. She told me Alec had been in Vietnam and disappeared there in 1972. Dr. and Mrs. Shimkin wrote me a letter. They explained that Alec had gone to Vietnam, not as a soldier, but as part of International Volunteer Services, a privately funded organization like the Peace Corps that operated in the middle of the war. Alec had taught villagers about breeding and care of pigs, and he learned to speak the Vietnamese language very well. Then Alec quit International Volunteer Services because of an incident. Communist guerrilla fighters had planted landmines in a road, and the South Vietnamese army forced villagers to remove the mines with their bare hands, which was very dangerous. Alec resigned from international volunteer services because if he stayed with them, he would have to work with the South Vietnamese army every day, and he could not do that with integrity. Alec got a job as a correspondent for Newsweek magazine, who needed someone who could speak Vietnamese and get stories directly from the Vietnamese people. Then Alec went out in his Jeep and vanished. After telling me this, Alec's parents invited me to visit them in Urbana, Illinois. I went there in early 1975, and Alec's father and I went down to Marks, Mississippi with Drive. Charles Williams, a black anthropologist from Mississippi. I introduced Alec's father and Dr. Williams to William Franklin, the black man who had let Alec and me live in his house while we worked for the civil rights movement. Alec's father encouraged me to keep coming back to Marks to interview people and write a book about the civil rights movement there in Marks. It would be the first book of its kind, a book about the civil rights movement in one small southern town as told by the people who lived there. Alec's father paid for me to take the bus back to Oklahoma. That summer I gave a talk at a festival called Share Week on the campus of Oklahoma University. At Share Week, there was a man called Rainbow Atma and a woman called Anda. They were there to encourage people to go to the 1975 Rainbow Gathering in Arkansas. I remembered about that gathering, but I gave it no thought. Instead, I was going to Marks, Mississippi to start doing interviews for the book. On the way, I wanted to stop and see my friends Bob and Linda Pardon, who were in a commune in the Arkansas Ozarks. Bob Pardon had also been a civil rights worker in Mississippi. After that, he had been part of the national leadership of SDS. Bob and Linda had a child named after me. I visited their commune in 1973. I hitched from Norman to Fort Smith, Arkansas. I arrived there at nightfall. I didn't want to stand by the highway all night, and in those days I never carried a sleeping bag, so I went to the bus station and bought a ticket to Conway, Arkansas. The bus to Conway would not come through until after daybreak, so I could stay in the bus station all night. When the bus got to Conway, I would hitch north into the Ozarks to visit my friends, the Pardons. While I was in the bus station, a long-haired man came in and asked me if I wanted to spend the night in the Salvation Army. I went there with him. He told me he was running the Fort Smith Salvation Army. He smoked a joint with me and gave me a bowl of ice cream. He also told me that my friends, the Pardons, would not be at their commune. Everybody with hair in Arkansas will be at the gathering, he said. He added that the gathering was near Harrison, Arkansas. So next morning, I took the bus to Conway and hitched to Harrison instead of the commune. In Harrison, I met a man named Easy who wanted to go to the gathering with his cousin Pam and her boyfriend Jerry. I had some money that Alec's father had sent me, so I paid for gas for Jerry's car. He drove us around on dirt roads in the hills around Harrison. I found out later that the gathering was so hard to find that my friends, the Pardons, gave up and went back to their commune. But we found the gathering site and started to drive into it when two men came running up yelling, "It's a bust! It's a bust! Leave here and come back later." We did leave for a while. When we came back, we found that the sheriff's department had come into the gathering site and arrested 7 people. By now it was nightfall. People led us with flashlights down a steep path to the Buffalo River. I took off my clothes and held them over my head while I crossed the river, which was up to my chest. I came to the gravelly place where everyone was camped. A woman shouted, "Welcome home." It was like a baptism. The next day, I met up with Freedom. This was the first gathering he had ever actually attended, just as it was for me, since he had turned away from the first gathering in 1972. Compared to when I had seen Freedom in Norman, his complexion looked so much healthier that he was hard to recognize. I wandered around the gathering. I would hear someone call out that there was a need for firewood, and at once people came running with dead branches. Who was in charge of all this activity? I saw people who I thought might be the leader, Don Moser, Foxfire, Medicine Story, but I couldn't see that they were doing anything to coordinate the activity. As a matter of fact, I found out later that Medicine Story was at the gathering for the first time, just like I was. I stayed at the gathering for another night. The next morning, July 4, 1975, Pam, Jerry, and Easy took me back to Harrison, Arkansas, before the silent circle started. I hitched with a Japanese rock and roll singer named Bushi Ota, who had been at the gathering. We got a ride with a van coming from the gathering. The people in the van took us to a Rolling Stones concert in Memphis and showed us how to sneak in without paying. Coming from the gathering, I noticed how the Stones were raising huge amounts of energy in the crowd, yet they were not using that energy for any positive purpose like collecting firewood. As we left the concert, we passed by heaps of Coke cans left by the crowd. These heaps were as high as my head. All I could think was, what a waste. I took a bus from Memphis to Clarksdale, Mississippi, 70 miles to the south, and went 17 miles to the east to Marks. I started interviewing local black people. I was filling up a notebook with these interviews, but I knew I had far to go. I went back to Norman. I heard that a lot of people from the gathering were camped out on the land of a 41-year-old woman who called herself Oro, just outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma. I had known Oro since 1973, when she lived in Norman. These rainbow people on Oro's land were hoping to get jobs repairing damage from a tornado that had just struck Stillwater. I hitched up to Oro's place and met up there with Jerry Delaney and his girlfriend Mimi. Jerry had been going to the gathering since the first one near Granby, Colorado in 1972. Jerry and Mimi wanted to drive a camper to California, but they didn't have enough gas money. I had some money I had just been paid for giving a talk to a class at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. The talk was on the environmental problems of a poverty area, the Delta country of Mississippi, where I had worked in the civil rights movement. I wanted to go to San Francisco to talk to the people at Rolling Stone magazine. In those days, Rolling Stone had a company called Straight Arrow that published books. I wanted to see if they would publish 2 books by me when I finished them. One book was the one I was doing on the civil rights movement in Marks, Mississippi. The other was a book of interviews of people around the state of Oklahoma, which I had been working on in 1974 and 1975. I got the idea for this book from books of interviews by Studs Terkel. Jerry, Mimi, and I got as far as Albuquerque, New Mexico, when we began to run out of money. Jerry had the address of Jason and Feather in Reserve, a town of about 500 in the mountains of New Mexico, far off the main roads. Jerry said we could go visit Jason and Feather and see if we could get jobs in Reserve to make enough money to go to California. When we got to Reserve, we found out from Feather that Jason was away in a camp in the National Forest with Freedom, Pip, and Riddle thinning out the smaller trees. We visited them, and then we stayed in their house in Reserve while Feather took her son Sean, who was 15 months old, up to the camp in the mountains. Feather's 10-year-old daughter Tracy, known then as Grasshopper, stayed behind with us. The first job we got was at a ranch. Jerry was cutting up logs with a chainsaw, and I was hauling them in a pickup to a pile of firewood. I had not driven a vehicle in 10 years, since 1965. When I got my driver's license at age 16, I drove so badly that I had a restricted license. I couldn't drive without another licensed driver in the car until I was 18. After a while, Jerry came running up as I was driving another pickup load of wood to the firewood pile. He shouted, "Watch out or you'll fuck up the transmission." I thought to myself, what's a transmission? My Life Part 5, Jodey Bateman. We finished the job cutting up and hauling firewood. Then Bob Atwood, a county official, found us a job laying sewer pipe for a new housing development in the little town of Reserve. I spent 2 days screwing up. As one worker on the crew told me, it was obvious I had never handled a shovel before. I had this new burst of energy in the last 2 years, and my coordination had improved. But my knowledge of work was at things like Pizza Hut, not the heavy labor of laying pipe. Even if I had improved physically, it was still like I was breaking through a heavy layer of rock that surrounded me. I thought to myself, what a difficult thing it is to get involved in Rainbow. Do I have what it takes? At the end of the second day, I was fired. I felt a small taste of the humiliation many workers must feel when they get fired. But Jerry Delaney, who had gotten the pipe-laying job with me, was an experienced and skillful worker. Yet the representative of the company, which was based in Albuquerque, was doing everything in his power to make Jerry quit. Finally, one day, Jerry was down in the bottom of the ditch. The company representative encouraged another young worker to pour a shovelful of dirt on Jerry's head. Jerry quit then. Jerry and I went to see Bob Atwood, the county official who got us the job. He explained to us that he had had a lot of complaints about this particular outfit from Albuquerque, so he was watching them for possible legal action against them. They were trying to get rid of employees as soon as possible before they would have any legal obligations to their workers. Atwood had us write statements about our experiences with this company for use in a possible case against them. He got us another job with a local employer building the foundations of a church. I screwed up a lot there. Fortunately, the employer was a kind-hearted man. When that job was over, Jerry and his girlfriend Mimi decided to stay in reserve. I now had a little money from the jobs. I hitched to Los Angeles to visit friends. Then I went up to Palo Alto to see David Harris, who had been a civil rights worker with me for a while in Marks, Mississippi. He had been 18 then, now he was 29. David had been student body president at Stanford University. Then he had married the folk singer Joan Baez. Shortly after that, he went to prison for refusing to be drafted. When he got out of prison, he and Joan Baez got divorced. Now their 6-year-old son Gabriel was staying with him. I wanted to see David because I had seen articles written in Rolling Stone magazine. I wondered if he could put in a word with Rolling Stone to persuade them to publish my books. But David told me he had not written for Rolling Stone for some time. So I went to San Francisco to the office of Rolling Stone. They told me they had closed down their Straight Arrow book publishing operation. So I went to San Diego to visit George Kirkpatrick, who had been a sociology professor at Oklahoma University. Someone else from Oklahoma was there, John Floyd, who had known my brother Jack since they were children. John's mother had been my father's secretary. John had been active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War and had spent 6 months in prison for trespassing on an Air Force base during an anti-war demonstration. He gave me a ride back to Norman. I walked into a bar in Norman and met up with an old friend who told me I looked completely transformed. He said he noticed it when I looked him straight in the eye when we met up, instead of ducking my head like before. However much I was a screw-up at those jobs, I had begun some sort of transformation with Rainbow. In December 1975, I went with Don Moser and a woman named Mish and others on an old school bus to the first regional Rainbow gathering, which was in the Everglades near Naples, Florida. Then in the summer of 1976, I thought I still wasn't skilled enough in the work of the gathering to show up early in Montana and help set it up. I planned to be there only in the days around the 4th of July. But in early June, I received a letter from Freedom and a woman named Lynette asking me to hurry up the gathering in Lewis and Clark National Forest. I didn't yet have a sleeping bag, but I took a blanket with me. Every night I slept in a different state. In Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and then Montana. After my second night in Montana, I reached the gathering. It was in a place where there had been a forest fire, and the setting was dramatic silvery gray trunks of trees that had been through the fire standing up among boulders, with mountains not far from us. At the gathering site, I saw Barry Plunker Adams and Sonny Mason for the first time with their son Shaneka, who was only a few months old. I remember how Garrick taught me some of the necessary skills. The weather was chilly and windy. A few times there were flurries of snow. Garrick wanted to put up a big shelter for people who, just like me, didn't have a tent. This involved tying a large canvas by ropes to upright poles. Garrick looked like a sailor on the deck of a ship in a storm as he tied the canvas to the poles in spite of the high winds that were trying to blow the canvas away. I began to follow Garrick's example with some instruction from him shouted through the wind. After the shelter was up, Garrick took a shovel and handed me another shovel and we dug a shitter together. I am glad he taught me that skill. I have dug shitters since then at almost all the gatherings I have attended. I think one of the best compliments I ever received was from Mountain at the Arizona gathering of 1979, 3 years after Garrick showed me how to dig a shitter. Mountain had been digging irrigation ditches since he was a teenager. He told me I handled a shovel really well, like I knew what to do with it. It was only 4 years after the man in Reserve, New Mexico, had told me I obviously didn't know how to handle a shovel. After the 1976 gathering, I visited my old friends Bob and Linda Pardon at their commune in Arkansas, and then went to Marks, Mississippi, again to do more interviews with local black people for the book about the civil rights movement in their town. In 1977, I went to the gathering in New Mexico. I also went to Mississippi to do more interviews for the book. And I began the first interviews for a book on Rainbow. I had gotten the idea from a book called 4 Men by the anthropologist Oscar Lewis. His book was the first part of a trilogy, 4 Men, 4 Women and Neighbors. These were books of in-depth interviews with ordinary people in Cuba about living through a revolution, a drastic social change. None of the people I have interviewed in Rainbow have lived through anything as extreme as a revolution. However, they have lived through a time of great social change in the USA. This book is an oral history of the counterculture. The first person I interviewed for this book in fall 1977 was in the STP family. In those days, I frequently had STP folks trekking through my apartment to the bathroom to use the shower. My apartment door was always open. My Life, Part 6, Jodey Bateman. In the next few years, I was going to gatherings and taking down more life stories from Rainbow brothers and sisters. I was also going back to Marks, Mississippi, and writing down the memories of the black people who had helped me find the whole direction of my life. I met up with another person who was to be very important in my life. In the summer of 1981, I was hitching north from Silver City, New Mexico, to the rural community of Pleasanton to see Jason and Feather, who had a farm there. A car stopped to pick me up. There were 3 women in the car. One of them I do not remember at all. Another was Eddie Lou Reed, who later took the name of Summer Breeze. At this time, she was 47 years old and working as a nurse. I was 39. The other woman in the car was a midwife. The 3 women were going to the little town of Reserve to meet with Summer Breeze's daughter-in-law, Georgianne, to help her do a rehearsal for the birth of her son Aspen, now a man in his 30s. They let me off at Pleasanton, where I went to Jason and Feather's farm. Later on, Jason rented a room from Summer Breeze in Silver City. I would visit him and Summer Breeze. At that time, he was an iron worker, helping to build a smelter, about 30 miles east of Silver City. He did his job walking around on steel beams, 150 feet above the ground. Summer Breeze had just learned how to weave baskets. When I visited her, she gave me one of her baskets, which I sent as a present to my father. My father and my brother Jack had both been in Alcoholics Anonymous for almost 2 years. Jessie Merchant, my father's wife, was a wonderful woman who tried to help me and my brother Jack build a relationship with my father. It was a long, gradual process. My mother and my grandmother both died in 1985. My grandmother lived about 4 months longer than my mother and died at the age of 91. She had always said she would outlive all 3 of her children, and she did. My brother Jack, who had trained as a nurse, visited my grandmother in the old folks' home every day up until the day of her death. Dr. Alec Shimkin, the professor of anthropology who encouraged me to write the book about Marks, Mississippi, helped me find 2 academic publishing houses that might want the book. One of these publishing houses seemed especially enthusiastic. But then they suddenly seemed much less eager. They finally admitted to me that they were afraid of libel suits. Some of the black people I had interviewed made some frank comments about the behavior of some local white officials. The publisher said that even if I didn't use the names of these officials, it would be obvious who they were, so the book couldn't be printed at that time. I gave a copy of the manuscript to Susan Miller. She is from the Oklahoma Seminole tribe. I met her in the 60s when she was in Oklahoma University SDS. At the time I gave her the copy, she was at a university in Arizona, where she taught Native American studies. She was very enthusiastic about the book and said she would be on the lookout for potential publishers. At that time I had only one other copy of the manuscript of the Mississippi book. I left it with other manuscripts of my writings with my friends Bob Wilson and Lisa Houston of Norman. As for the manuscript of the life stories of Rainbow people, I stored it with Garrick Beck in Santa Fe. I had been visiting Silver City, New Mexico, so often that I moved there in 1993. Summer Breeze and I both put in some money to buy an old school bus, which became my home in her backyard. I taught Latin, Spanish, and current events at Meadowhawk, an alternative school, which Summer Breeze's son Jesse had started. Also, to make my living, I edited other people's manuscripts for publication, and I also did translations from the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. I sold a couple of these translations to be published. All this was with the help of Summer Breeze. In 1998, I made a last journey to Marks, Mississippi, where I saw Mrs. Henrietta Franklin for the last time. I had stayed with her and her family for 2 years in the 1960s. In 1989, William Franklin, her husband, died. In the course of that journey, I stopped in Norman, Oklahoma, and found out that the manuscripts I had left in a basement had been destroyed in a flood, including the manuscript of the book on Marks, Mississippi. At that time, I didn't remember that Susan Miller also had another copy of the manuscript, and I didn't know how to reach her anyway. So for me, the loss of that manuscript was like a death in the family. It was the loss of the only record that could be made of the older generation of a whole black community. Many of these people were illiterate, and I was the only person they had left their history with. Not long after I got back, Simon Cuthbert Kerr, a historian in Scotland, contacted me. I was the only former civil rights worker he could find who had been in Marks. My Life, Part 7, Jodey Bateman. In May 2014, Summer Breeze died a week after her 80th birthday. She was the one who gave me a place to stay so I could work on various projects. The home she gave me enabled me to keep the very good health I have now at the age of 76 in 2018. I will always miss her and be grateful to her. I sometimes think I kept this good health so I would be able to help do something about the difficult but fascinating times we have lived in since the election of 2016. I voted for Hillary Clinton, and if she was running with Trump as her opponent, I would vote for her again. But I have to acknowledge that by the fact of his election, Trump knocked over a political structure that was already decayed and rotten, the structure that Hillary Clinton and George Bush were both part of. It is not their fault that the structure was decayed and rotten. Neither is it Trump's fault. Trump is simply a political adventurer who came along at what, for him, was the right time. Whatever comes after Trump, it will not be the world we knew before the 2016 election. I think Rainbow is part of building a possible better world that might come afterwards. Rainbow is the only movement that reaches large numbers of white working-class youth with a message for environmentalism and against racism. Rainbow reaches the sort of working-class young people that Trump has been appealing to, and that the Democrats failed to reach. These youth are our brothers and sisters. Let us welcome them,